Hi and welcome. In this video, I'm going to show you a very important design pattern that governs how iOS apps are architected and built. Now, if you haven't heard of the term design pattern before, it's just a technical term for a best practice solution. In iOS, the most common way to architect an app is using the MVC design pattern, and MVC stands for Model View Controller. Now, this isn't the only design pattern out there, but it's the one that Apple uses themselves, and it's the recommended starting point before learning some of the other more complicated design patterns. Alright, so now let's dive in and see what MVC is all about. MVC stands for Model View Controller, and what it does is to help separate the responsibilities within an app. Let's talk about each of these three pieces separately. The view is the easiest to explain first, and this is what the user sees when they look at your app. The responsibility of the view is to display the user interface and to detect events from the user, such as taps and swipes. Now next, aside from user interface elements, such as buttons and labels, usually your screen is displaying some sort of data or information, right? Well, where does this information come from? And this brings us to the M part of MVC, which stands for the model or the data model. The model represents the data in your app. The responsibility of the model is to manage that data, whether that comes from a database or through a feed somewhere. Now, in between the model and the view, there is a central component in the middle, and that is what the C stands for in MVC. The responsibility of the controller is to handle the communication between the model and the view. And that communication is actually twofold. Number one, when the view detects a user interaction, such as a tap, the controller is responsible for handling it and deciding what to do with that event. Now let's say that it's a list of data and the user taps a delete button next to a particular row. The view would detect that event and pass it to the controller, who then needs to tell the model to update its data. Now number two, the controller also gets input from the model. For example, when the screen loads, the controller might ask the model for some data to display in the view. The model would gather that data and return it to the controller, who then hands it to the view for display. So as you can see, the view, the controller, and the model all have their own distinct responsibilities. Well, you might ask now, why would we even want to separate these different responsibilities? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Number one is to keep things simple. When your app architecture is clean and simple like this, that leads to code that is likely to have less bugs and is easier to troubleshoot when there is a problem because you know where to look. Now, number two is reusability. So the idea is that you keep the model independent from the controller and the view as much as possible. In your app, you might have multiple screens, and each screen will have its own view and a controller that manages that view. However, if you're able to keep the model independent, then multiple screens can leverage the same model. Furthermore, if you do a really good job at keeping that data model independent, you would be able to switch out that data source in the future. Let's say it's connecting to this database and then you swap it over to a different database, and the controller and the view would be none the wiser. So as you can see, this is great for maintenance and reusability. Now in the Xcode apps that we've built so far, you might have noticed that our projects start with a storyboard and the view controller class. These are two parts of the MVC design pattern. The view is represented visually by the storyboard, and the view controller class in your project is the controller that we've been talking about that manages that view. The default Xcode project doesn't come with a model class because it doesn't know what sort of data your app will have. To make all of this information more concrete, let's take a look at the app that we're going to build in this module, and then I'll explain how we will architect it in terms of MVC. First, take a look at the user interface. What sorts of data gets displayed? Well, we have 16 cards, and since this app is about finding matching pairs, that means we have 8 pairs of matching cards. So we'll have a model class that handles this data. Its responsibility will be to randomly generate 8 pairs of matching cards. When the app starts, the view controller will request those 8 random pairs of cards from the model. The model will generate them and then give that data to the view controller. And the view controller will give that data to the view for display. Now, in what form will that data be in when the model passes it to the view controller? We know that the data consists of 16 cards, but for each card there are important details such as what image to use for that card as well as the status of that card. There are actually two statuses we need for each card. Number one, has this card been flipped? And number 2, has this card been matched? Now combined with the image file name, that's 3 pieces of data for each of the 16 cards. This totals 48 different pieces of information that we need to keep track of. Now rather than treat these pieces of data as independent pieces of information, we can instead group all of the relevant information for a single card into a card class. This way, we can simply create 16 card objects, and each card object would have 3 properties containing the details for that card. At the end of the day, the model will simply pass an array containing 16 card objects to the view controller. Now let's take a look at what happens when a user starts interacting with the view. The view tells the view controller each time the user taps on a card, and the view controller will determine what to do based on whether the 2 cards that were flipped over match or they don't match. There's also another class that we will be creating, which is a customized cell of the collection view. And you're going to learn about what a collection view is later on, but for now, it's simply a user interface element that lets us display things in a grid. And the reason we're going to create a custom cell of the collection view is so that we can control how the cells in the grid will look. Now, having gone through this, you might be thinking to yourself, how am I supposed to come up with this for my own app? Now, here's the thing about experience. The more apps that you've built, the better you'll be able to come up with this for yourself just based on what you've seen and what you've done. If you're new to programming and you're working on this project for yourself, I would recommend that you just focus on getting things to work first, because beginners often focus so much on trying to write the perfect code or trying to do things the best way that it becomes so overwhelming they just give up. And I don't want that to happen to you. So if you're brand new to this, I would just focus on functionality first, because you can always go back and refactor your code. That's a process where we go back and try to optimize and make your code more efficient. Now, if you're working for a client or you're working at a company on a large team, then that's a different story altogether. All right, so in the next lesson, we'll actually be diving into Xcode and starting our project.